So here's the thing that also makes the PhD kind of difficult is you are working so hard to write this dissertation that you can convince all these professors is great and that therefore they should allow you to pass and receive your PhD. You're probably working as a teaching assistant or something like that. And you're also, while all this is going on, and you might be having a family or something to take care of, you are supposed to start looking for a job. Remember, as I mentioned in the previous video, you're also supposed to be publishing and going to conferences. Otherwise, you won't be able to get a job because, people want to see that you're actually capable of publishing. So it's really, really stressful. And it's very difficult, which is one reason why I don't encourage people necessarily to pursue a PhD. And I'll talk about why that's difficult momentarily, in addition just to all the work that you have to be doing, all the pressure that's on you. But let's talk a little bit about the kind of jobs you might be looking at. Your goal, if you want to be a professor, is a tenure track position, right? You definitely want a tenure track position. And notice here, employment level, this is an ad. I'll talk more about this later. It says tenured tenure track. This is what you want. Boom, full-time tenure track. I'll talk more about what tenure is, but basically, in a nutshell, it makes it really hard to fire you. So you want that. You want a tenure track position. You want a job that will eventually result in you being able to have relative job security. That's the best. For the most part, though, a lot of times you're not going to start off with a tenured track job. A lot of times your first job will be a visiting position. So my first job was a visiting position. I was a part-time visiting assistant professor, right? So visiting means a temporary position. It's not tenure track. You're only there for a short time. So I'll talk more about deans momentarily, but a dean is like an administrative position. And at a college, Eckerd College in Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, their Asianist became dean, and their deans, their usual professors taught 7 courses a year. The deans only taught 2, so they needed to hire someone to teach the remaining 5. But it was only a temporary position because there in that college, the dean position rotates, right? So to make this clear, their Asianist became dean. So instead of teaching 7 courses, he would only teach 2. So they need to hire someone to teach 5. But that job of teaching 5 courses, so that's only part-time, only 5/7 of the salary, that job would not last forever, only as long as that guy was dean. And because it's a visiting position, it's temporary, because it was only part-time, not as many people applied for it. And because of that, I was able to get it. I mean, frankly speaking, the applicant pool was relatively small, and that made it a little bit easier for me to get that job. But that got me experience, right? It's very different going into a job interview saying, well, if I were to teach a class, this is how I would teach it. Or as opposed to saying, oh, yes, I've taught that class before. Here's my syllabus. And I, in fact, had that moment where one of the professors, it was actually the dean, was interviewing me and said, what sort of class would you teach at Lander? And I'm like, well, at Eckerd College, students seem to like my Japanese history class. Here's a schedule and a syllabus. And I could see the dean's eyes light up because, oh, this guy's actually teaching this class, and this class looks interesting. We would certainly like it. But unfortunately, there's a good chance, and some people, they go right to tenure track. Other people are just going to be visiting for a while. I was a visiting professor for 1 year, and then I got a tenure track position here at Lander. Other people have to be visiting longer. I will talk about adjuncts later, but that's another way to get experience. But the visiting position is usually a full-time position. Mine was only part-time. My family was willing to back me up so I could survive on 5/7 of a already low salary, but we were able to make it, got me experience that I needed, and I could get this job. Another thing that sometimes people have is called a postdoc. Basically, a postdoc, usually a visiting position is more focused on teaching. Postdoc is more focused on research, and it means like postdoctoral. So it's just like it's for someone who just finished their PhD, and it gives them like another year or 2 to do work, to do research, to make that dissertation into a book or something like that. And postdocs are very competitive. They're hard to get. If you can't get a tenure track position, postdoc is great. But it's basically just kind of delaying, in a sense, getting a full-time job, because postdocs, like visiting positions, do not last forever. Now, they tend to be really cool because they're often at very prestigious universities, because they have the money to hire someone who doesn't really do much teaching, is just going to be mostly focusing on research. But that's another option. But ideally, a postdoc is meant to give you experience, give you publications that will then help you to get a tenure track position later on. So what happens? How do you actually apply for these jobs, right? What is the process? Well, first of all, these jobs are seasonal, right? They usually go with the academic year. So a lot of times, job ads will start appearing in the summer for the following year. So, for example, if jobs start appearing in the summer of 2020, you won't actually, if you're hired, you won't actually start until the fall of 2021. But jobs ads will usually start appearing in the summer, continue through the fall, and then a few will be coming in up till about February or March. If you haven't gotten something by then, you're probably going to have to wait another year. So there is a kind of seasonal rhythm. Basically, when you're a PhD, you should just be checking job ads all the time. You don't really want to start applying for them until you're actually writing your dissertation or maybe doing your research. It depends. But it's good to kind of watch them just to get a sense of, okay, when are these jobs coming in? If you start your job hunt in February, you're probably not going to find anything because those jobs will already be out. People want to get their job ads out early so they can maximize the number of people applying, so they can try and get the best, right? That's kind of the idea. So you want to be there early, you want to be applying. And you can kind of see that. This is kind of actually an interesting job ad, because usually it doesn't work this quickly, but they posted this April 15th and they're actually looking someone for the fall. So this job ad actually came out quite late. So you don't want to give up, but there's a very good chance that you will not have something until later, if you're not able to get something in the fall. In my case, I should point out, though, Lander hired me in February, and then I was working. They hired me in February of 2011, and I was working in the fall of 2011. But in any case, it's seasonal. Usually when you apply for a job, they will have a list of qualifications. I want to point out this job ad is much longer. And by the way, I got this from the Chronicle of Higher Education. This job ad is much longer than this. I just wanted to include a bit that you could actually see. Notice that it says require qualifications. So you need a PhD in history, and they want someone in modern world history who's either a specialist in one of these three things: African diaspora, Islamicate, or South Asia. So very broad range. So a lot of people are going to probably be applying for this. They want you to have a degree at time of application or official notification of completion, right? So that could be a document. I had to submit a document showing that. It says record of or demonstrate potential for effective teaching. So, for example, when I submitted my documentation to Lander, I included syllabi and schedules and copies of my teaching evaluations. Remember how I talked about the importance of being a teaching assistant? Teaching assistants get evaluations typically. And then I could submit those, and, when the student said good things about me, that looked good to Lander, right? That's kind of the idea. But the key thing is they're going to have a list of qualifications and a list of documents that you have to submit. And you have to prove all these things. They also often require letters of reference as well. Now, one thing I have to tell you about is that applying for jobs is extraordinarily depressing. To put together a job application, if I recall correctly, took me about 3 or 4 hours. Because you have to read the ad very carefully, and you have to write a letter. You write like I can't remember exactly what it's called. At least when I was doing it, it's called like a letter of interest. It may change by the time you're applying. But you have to write a letter, a couple pages long. You don't actually have that much space, because if it's really long, they won't read it. But in your letter, you have to explain why they should hire you. And to do that effectively, you have to carefully read their job ad to figure out what they want. So that takes a while. And sometimes you have to look up the professors and see what they teach and what they specialize in, because you want to show that you are someone who will complement them, though not necessarily compete with them, right? You don't want to be studying the exact same thing that they are, because they'll see you as competition. You want to be studying something that's similar enough that they will say, hey, this is someone I can talk to, that their research is interesting to me. But suffice to say, it takes a long time to put together an application document, and you don't know if they'll even look at it because they may receive more than 100 people applying for the job. And that's kind of depressing, to put hours of work into something that no one may look at seriously. And there's like wiki pages. You can look this up. It may be a different place. So I don't want to mention it exactly. But there's like graduate students have like web pages where they share information about a job, and they'll say like, yeah, someone's been hired. They just haven't announced it or something like that. And sometimes they'll list how many people applied, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of people. So it could be like 60, 70, over 100. Now, if you're fortunate, though, what happens next, if they like your letter, you will get a phone interview. And usually when you get a phone interview, again, it depends on a lot of different factors, but you're probably 1 in 12. And this is like a 20, 30-minute conference call where they will call you, the professors, and they will ask you some questions, and you will need to answer those questions. And it's good to, again, I won't go into this here because it would go on forever, but you can find different books and things, or you can approach me later, and I'll be happy to share with you. I had a list of questions that they might ask me, and I had answers already like bullet pointed out, and I practiced before the job interview because you've only got one, opportunity to make a good first impression. And also I want to point out, they will always ask you, do you have any questions for us? And you better have questions. And it's good to come up with, you study their websites, get some idea of their research, find something, a question that allows them to brag about themselves and makes them feel good about themselves and shows that you care enough to have studied them. So if you pass the phone interview where you're about 1 in 12, you'll go for a campus visit. And if you make it to a campus visit, you're probably like 1 in 3. When I applied for the visiting position, I was like 1 in 2. But usually you're 1 in 3. And a campus visit is really difficult. Usually you'll fly in like in the afternoon. They will pay for you, or they should pay for you to fly in. You'll be picked up by someone from the university, usually one of the professors in the department that's looking to hire. And and the interview starts then. And they'll drive you back to a hotel. And they usually will take you out for a meal. Then you spend the night. The next day, you will have a bunch of meetings with various administrators. You will usually have to teach a class to show that you can teach. And that day usually lasts from about 8 a.m. till about 8 p.m. So it's basically a 12-hour interview. And usually before you teach, they'll give you like half an hour to rest. But in my case, one of the professors who was going to possibly, part of the decision to hire me, part of the decision whether or not to hire people, they weren't able to make time for me to meet with him. So he wanted to meet with me during my break. So I said, of course, I'll be happy to meet with you. It's like, I want the job. I don't want to tell this guy, no, I won't meet with you. And he talked to me for my entire break. And finally he said, well, I've taken up a lot of time. I need to give you a chance to rest. And I had to say, well, I'm actually supposed to teach in 5 minutes. Can you show me where I'm supposed to teach? But it worked because I got the job. But as you can guess, that's very stressful. And then you have to wait for the phone call to see if you are going to get the job or not. Right? It's not like you go to the campus visit and then they give you the job. They have to discuss who's going to get the job or not. And then after that, you can negotiate, maybe try and raise up the salary or something. It's very complex. It's not easy. So this is kind of the process you go to find a job. It's very difficult to do. Now, to kind of continue, I do want to say a little bit more about what professors do. So, I love this picture, I think, because it's like action professor, right? Like it's really funny. I do think that's kind of a funny picture. But the most that you think about professors is probably how we teach. And that makes sense because that's your main point of contact with us. But there's 2 other things we have to do. One is called service. Now, this is me engaging in service by helping to fire a cannon, right? That's me. We're at 96. Firing what's called a swivel gun, a small cannon. Now, what is service? How does that have to do with service? Well, there's different kinds of service, but this would be considered like community service. As a historian, I'm going out to the community. This is actually me training to use the cannon, so I could do weapons demonstrations with it. But the idea is that this allows me to go out to the community and share history with them. That's part of the job of universities, to interact with the community. So that's like community service. Other kinds of service would, for example, be serving on a committee to hire someone, right? We want to hire someone. We need to have people on the committee to interview that person. And that's a lot of work because of all the people who apply for jobs. So that's an example of service. I was on it's changed now, but I was on something called the Appeals and Petitions Committee. So the university has certain rules, right? So there's a certain date you have to drop by, right? If you want to drop a class, there's a certain date that you want to drop by. But let's say that you're getting ready to drop the class and you get in a car accident and you're in the hospital for a week and you're physically unable to drop the class. And we actually had a case like that where a student wanted to drop the class but was injured and couldn't do it. Well, that's a rule that you can't drop a class after a certain date, but this person had a good reason. Well, in those cases, that person would bring their case to our committee and we would decide whether or not they had a valid case. And in that case, that person did have a valid case. But, being on part of that committee, we have to spend time reviewing these cases. We have to actually have the meeting, and then we argue sometimes about whether or not, the student has a really good reason and whether we should allow them to ignore the rule or not. But that's what service is. So it's not that we're just teaching. And sometimes people get the wrong idea. It's like, oh my gosh, professors only teach like 12 hours a week. Such an easy job. Well, no, we spend a lot of times in committees and doing other things. Another important part of our job is doing research, right? We do research. We study. We do original research. So for example, as part of that, we may go to conferences. Again, I think this is a hilarious picture because it looks like I'm really angry at someone. Like I guess they gave me orange juice and I want a Coke or something. I don't know. But in any case, this is an example of a conference where here we are sitting around a table, listening to someone who's over here presenting. And then later on, we'll get our chance to present and then we share our ideas and we discuss them. And to do this, you have to write a paper and you give a presentation. Usually the paper is like 10 or 12 pages. And then you get up and give a presentation. And usually these could be small conferences of just a few hundred people. Some of the conferences like the Association for Asian Studies annual meeting may have several thousand people. And I like to attend that one every several years. And it's very interesting. It helps you keep, not only do you get to share your research and get feedback on it, it also shows you what other people are doing so you can stay on the cutting edge of history. So you can, people sometimes joke that history doesn't change. It certainly does. And hopefully you've, gotten a sense of that through this class. But that's something that we do. And of course, that means spending a lot of time doing research, writing the paper, traveling to the conference, being there at the conference, usually there 2 to 3 days, and then, of course, coming home. Now, one thing I should point out, again, professors, we don't work in the vacuum. It's very important for us to work with other people. And you may remember from the other video, I talked about Shanae Park, the woman who was a teaching assistant with me. And she made it to Harvard, which is great. She's a professor at Harvard. She specialized in food history, which sounds delicious and which is awesome. But that's her, and that's this was her husband and her son, right? And this is another woman, John-Hae Sun. She was also at University of British Columbia. She was a linguist. But this is us meeting at a conference. So at the conference, not only do we go hear research, this is also a time for us to hang around with other professors. And you kind of think about it like this, right? I'm a specialist in Korea. There's no other specialists in Korea at Lander. And I'm the only specialist in Asia. So it's nice to be around people who are specialists in my area. So I can talk to them, share ideas, and so forth. And this is where we engage in a lot of social networking, find people to do research with, and things like that. And ideally, those conferences will lead to publications, right? Ideally, those conferences will lead to publications. So for example, you may present a paper, you get feedback on it, and then based on that feedback, you will hopefully be able to make your paper better and then publish it in a journal. Talked about journals before. I just want to give a couple examples of publications I helped do. This is one with my advisor. His name is bigger than me because he did most of the work, but I did enough that my name also got to go on the cover. And then this is a translation a colleague of mine and I did about of the documents of this man, An Chung-gun, a very important Korean nationalist figure, though he did a lot of other things too. So we also are expected to publish work, right? So as professors, and if you want to become a professor, you don't just teach, you also have to do service to the community and to the university, to the profession. For example, I'm also help edit a journal, and I'm on a committee I will be I'm on some committees for other journals. And of course, you're also expected to publish your research. So you keep busy, but, ideally you enjoy it. And I like to say, being a graduate student is kind of like hell. Being an assistant professor is kind of like purgatory. And you're assistant professor usually when you first start. Being a tenured professor is kind of like heaven, because you can do this fun stuff that you enjoy. And we'll stop there. We'll pick up with another part momentarily.